My name is Sham Subramanian, and I'm Southern California Counsel with Alliance for Justice. And we're a nonprofit organization that trains nonprofits on the legal rules of advocacy and civic engagement. So we do trainings like these both in person and webinar. And then we also have publications that are available online. I brought some today, so feel free to pick some up. They're short 1 to 2 page fact sheets on what you can do as a nonprofit organization to advance your mission through public policy advocacy and also through different types of civic engagement activities like voter registration, get out the vote. And if you'd like other materials, I can email you as well. So if you want to sign in, I have a sign-in sheet here, and I'll be happy to send you more information afterwards. So in addition to our trainings and our publications, we have a technical assistance service. So if you are working on a project at your nonprofit and you have a question about what can I do, what am I not permitted to do, is this close to the line, you can always email us or call us. And we have attorneys on call in Dallas, Oakland, Los Angeles, where I'm based, and then also Washington, D.C. And Monday through Friday, you can email us. We can't provide legal advice or represent your organization, but we can walk you through any of the relevant legal rules that impact your ability to do your advocacy work. So I'm just curious, how many people are here from a 501c3 nonprofit organization? And what about, okay, so everyone here is, so that's what I'm gonna be focusing on today is what you can do on behalf of your nonprofit that's a 501c3 specifically. And can everyone see the PowerPoint all right? Do I need to move it all? Okay. So just as an overview, I'm going to quickly go over some of the differences between different types of nonprofits, and then look at the ways that you can legally advocate for community change. And some of you may be doing this already, but there are many avenues you can take. And one of those avenues is lobbying, a type of advocacy. And oftentimes, people are reluctant to lobby because of how it looks, or the word lobbying, people are reluctant as a nonprofit organization. But you can do a lot as a public charity when you lobby, and you are permitted to lobby as long as you stay within your IRS limits. So you can think of that as an allotment that you have towards lobbying. And then finally, I just want to touch on how you can engage specifically during an election year and what you can and can't do when you are talking to voters or candidates about the issues that you care about or the communities that you're serving. So this is just an overview of the different types of nonprofits. Since everyone's a 501c3 public charity, you'll be in the left column here. So these types of organizations include Arts for LA, and the numbers at the top just come from the federal tax code, and they describe these different types of organizations. So these organizations, as you know, don't have to pay federal corporate income tax, and also a benefit that they have is that individuals who contribute to these organizations receive a tax deduction. So that's a benefit to the individual donors. It's also a way for these organizations to raise money. And it's also easier for private foundations to provide grants to these organizations as compared to other types of nonprofits. So all that together means that 501c3s can often raise more money than their other nonprofit counterparts. So in exchange for that, in exchange for this beneficial treatment, there are some limitations, some restrictions. So you are permitted to lobby, and I'll get into what it means, but basically lobbying is trying to influence legislation. So you're trying to ask your city to increase funding in its budget for arts and culture, for example, or your county board of supervisors, or you're trying to ask your state legislature. A previous session was talking about a cultural district bill. So if it's something that a legislature has to pass, then that typically would be lobbying. So that's just something to keep in mind when I talk about lobbying. There may be other advocacy that you do that's not asking the legislature to pass a bill, or Congress, state, city council, county board of supervisor. And then the one real restriction to keep in mind when you are engaging in electoral activities is that you can't support or oppose candidates as a 501c3. So you can still educate voters, you can do get out the vote, but you just have to be careful not to endorse a candidate or even implicitly suggest that one candidate is better on the issues. That's really the one real restriction that you have to think about. But I want to really focus on what you can do rather than there's restriction. And so I want to give some concrete ways that you can get involved and still stay nonpartisan. And I just want to mention about these other types of nonprofits. They're also tax exempt. They don't pay federal corporate income tax, but they don't receive the benefit of individuals being able to take a tax deduction when they donate to these organizations. So that's a very important difference, and often why these types of nonprofits are unable often to receive the same amount of money as a 501c3. And then also I should note that some other differences are that a 501c4 nonprofit, for example, is not limited in how much lobbying it can do. It can do an unlimited amount. And also they can support or oppose candidates. It just can't be the primary activity, the main thing that they do. So I'm going to be focusing on these two aspects as a 501c3 organization. So what is advocacy? How many of you all, just from a show of hands, are engaging in advocacy, trying to influence public policy through your nonprofit organization? Okay, so no one, but it is something that you're permitted to do. So in this particular example, it's talking about the San Francisco city budget and thanking legislators for their role in increasing funding for arts and culture. So this is something you're permitted to do. It can be an effective way to advance your cause beyond your providing direct services or beyond what you're doing in your community directly. Influencing public policy can be a great way to magnify the impact of your organization. Are any groups doing any of the following activities in green? Voter education, trying to change a corporate behavior, leadership training, research, any of the activities in green? Leadership training? Okay. So these activities are all green because you're not restricted in any way from doing these activities by the IRS. So you don't have to worry about losing your tax exemption. You can educate legislators, you can encourage voting. Many nonprofit groups are doing this right now. Get out the vote operations, voter registration. That's all something that you can safely do and may be important ways to reach your communities and educate them about the issues that are important. Lobbying is in yellow because, as I mentioned, it's limited. And the activity in red, partisan political activity, is the one real restriction that there is. So how many of you all have thought about lobbying or considered it at all? Any interest in trying to influence legislation?
Basic interest.
Okay, so if you decide to do it, you should just know that there are some limitations. And the one thing I want to note about this is that by filling out a one-page form, if you look at this second part called the 501H expenditure test, it's just a one-page form that you can fill out. And what it does is you get an expenditure amount that you can spend on lobbying activities. And it's pretty generous. If your budget is $500,000, then you can spend up to 20% of that on lobbying. That includes, again, trying to influence legislation at any level, at the city level, county level, state level. So if you are thinking about it, this is one step that you can take. You can talk to your board members, your leadership. You just fill out a one-page form and put it to the IRS. So what does that mean? These are the lobbying limits based on your overall budget generally. So $500,000, it's 20%. And as it goes up, you get a little bit less, but it's still very generous in an amount that you can do. So you may be asking, okay, what does it exactly mean to lobby? I've been using the word a lot. So lobbying generally is directly, you're communicating with legislators. You're trying to ask them to pass a certain bill, the cultural district bill, increase funding for the arts, or you're doing grassroots lobbying, where you're trying to ask the public to contact their legislators, or you're creating petitions that people can sign. So these are examples of lobbying activities. And I think that these can be effective ways to both engage people in the community, grassroots organizing, and then also have an impact, because a lot of times elected officials don't hear from underserved communities. They hear from people with money and people with influence already. And so these are important voices that are often left out of the legislative process. And that's why at Boulder Advocacy, we think it is really important that these voices are amplified and these stories are heard. And elected officials, when they hear enough of these stories, it can really influence them to vote in a certain way on a certain bill. Are any groups thinking about ballot measures or any ballot measures that are very important to that organization's mission? Just from a show of hands. No consideration? Okay. So that's also something that you can do as a public charity, is support or oppose ballot measures publicly. This is something that's permitted. It would just be counted as lobbying. So you would just need to track it to make sure that you're staying within your limits. So in these two examples, there's Yes to S, Save Our Arts and Families. I believe this was a ballot measure in San Francisco. And then there's 4B, which was a sales tax to fund arts and culture in Colorado. So there are many ballot measures, and also not just related to arts, but maybe related to affordable housing, as it was discussed earlier, transit-oriented development, parks, etc. Your organization can get involved in that as a public charity. So there's a lot you can do. Yes?
So you can't support a candidate, but you can support ballot measures.
That's right, yeah.
Even if the candidate is like in support of the certain, interests that you have.
Yeah, so the question is about whether you can support a ballot measure if a candidate is supporting that ballot measure. In that circumstance, you just have to be careful not to look like you're supporting the candidate. So you should focus on the ballot measure itself, on the issue involved, rather than saying, we support Gavin Newsom, who's supporting this ballot measure. It's important to focus on the issue so it doesn't look like you're supporting the candidate in reality. So I want to talk about how you can be engaged specifically during an election year. So you can continue to do lobbying and issue advocacy even though it's an election year. You just want to make sure, again, that you're focusing on the issue rather than the candidates, and that you're trying to be educational in nature rather than trying to tell people which way they should vote on a candidate again. So this prohibition, this restriction against supporting candidates, applies if they are affiliated with a political party or not. And it also means that your organization shouldn't support or oppose political parties. So this applies to any level of government, at the presidential level, at the local level, a school board candidate, a judge that's running, for example. At any level, it's important to make sure your organization isn't looking like it's supporting or opposing. Great, so you can educate candidates about these issues. If you feel they don't understand something, you can send out materials that you have. This is permitted. You can advocate for your issues, again, staying away from the candidate part of it. And then the other thing I should note specifically about school boards is that if you're trying to influence a school board decision, the IRS doesn't consider that to be lobbying. There are specific entities that are not considered to be legislators. So if you're trying to increase funding for arts education or trying to influence how LCFF funds are spent, then that would not be considered lobbying activity, and you're not limited in how much you can do at the school board level. So that's something to keep in mind. And also voter education is permitted. So if you want to send out a guide to voters about important issues on the ballot and you're sticking to the issues, that's also permitted. And then I know that a lot of arts organizations are polling places, or they may be doing get out the vote or voter registration. So that's what I wanted to focus on. So if you're doing voter registration, and are any of the groups here planning to do voter registration or have done or considering it? So voter registration, the important thing to keep in mind is that it must be nonpartisan. So there shouldn't be a reference or a suggestion of who to vote for, or whether it's a candidate or political party. And it should be available to everybody. So even if they are not someone that you think would be sympathetic to your issues, or they belong to a political party that you don't agree with, they still should be able to use your voter registration service. And if you are planning to target individuals or communities, there should be a nonpartisan reason for your targeting. So if you work in a particular community, that's a nonpartisan reason for choosing that community. If it's a group that's underrepresented at the polls, maybe young people, so you'll see nonprofits going on campuses, or communities of color, low-income people, people that don't typically vote to the same extent as other groups, then you're permitted to target them for that reason. But it's important that you don't target specific districts because they're swing districts or because they're independents and you think they would be the most persuadable, or they belong to a certain party and that's why you want them to. And so I think that's really something to keep in mind. And these also apply, yes?
I had a question about that.
Sure.
The demographics of your museum, though, if you're targeting those people, will that be okay in terms of like if they do, like you have an educated group of people that come here?
Yeah.
Is it okay to target that group even though it might be a group that might be like?
Yeah, so I understand your question. It's like if a certain group has a propensity to vote a certain way,
Yeah.
but that's not the reason that you're targeting them. So it's important in that case to have documentation of why you're targeting a specific group. So put it in writing that we're choosing this community because we work with this community, and that's the reason. Having a track record is always helpful. If you have been doing things a certain way for a number of years, and then all of a sudden you're focusing on a certain group, then that starts to look like, well, what's your true reason? So if there is a complaint from somebody, from the outside, from another organization, you have something to point to say, no, we're really being nonpartisan here, this is why we're targeting them. And then I also want to point out that you as an individual can support or oppose candidates. You just want to make sure that you're doing it separate from your time at the nonprofit, that you're not using the charity resources to do it, the facilities. It's best if you go to a rally not to hand out your business cards or wear your organizational t-shirt. That's a best practice because it needs to be clear that you're not there on behalf of the nonprofit organization. And we have sample policies online that you can look at if you go to boulderadvocacy.org if you want to have a policy for your employees so that they know what they can and can't do. And this applies for your Twitter accounts. What we do at Alliance for Justice is we just have two separate Twitter accounts, one organizational, one personal, and then on my personal account, I tweet about election activities. So it's clear, look, I'm doing this on my own time, not on behalf of the organization. Because if you're tweeting about candidates from your organizational Twitter, it starts to blur the line between what's your personal activity and what's your organization's activity. So I wanted to stop there and then open it up for any other questions that people have. But I want to emphasize that there's a lot that you can do during an election year, focusing on your issues, educating people, advocating for your issues, and even after an election year, you can still lobby. You can push the legislature to increase funding for arts and culture or museums or cultural district bills. So I wanted to open it up and see if anyone else had any other questions at this time. Yeah, so the question was about why 501c3s are prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates. And it really goes back to the fact that when someone donates to a 501c3, they receive a tax deduction. So because they receive that benefit, Congress didn't want these organizations to become ways for individuals to make political contributions and receive a tax benefit from doing so. So there are other types of nonprofits where you don't get a tax deduction and they can still support or oppose candidates for that reason. So it's trying to make sure that really it's a charitable purpose that the charity is carrying out. Great, so almost there, just a week away, but this is something to keep in mind for future elections. And I hope you all will, if you have any questions, give us a call. And we have some short fact sheets here too that go over the rules, summarize the rules. And I'm happy to stay afterwards if any questions come up.